My name is Richard. I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I thought I understood what family meant. I thought I had raised my children to value loyalty, compassion, and love. But life has a way of testing everything you think you know. And in my case, that test came when my wife, the woman who had stood by me through decades of triumphs and struggles, was diagnosed with cancer. It all started one winter evening. Sarah, my wife of 58 years, had been feeling tired for weeks. She brushed it off as stress, as aging, as nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When the doctor delivered the news, stage 3 ovarian cancer, my world collapsed. I remember clutching Sarah's hand so tightly as though my grip alone could protect her from what was coming. For weeks, I tried to process it all. Chemo, radiation, hospital visits, it was overwhelming. But what made it worse was knowing that we couldn't face it alone. Sarah needed all the support she could get. And I believed, without a doubt, that our children would stand by us. We had 3 children, Michael, the eldest at 35, a successful banker in New York. Lily, 32, a marketing executive living just 2 hours away. And our youngest, Josh, 28, a software engineer. They were all independent, doing well in life, thanks to the sacrifices Sarah and I had made. I called them one by one, expecting empathy, maybe even urgency. "Dad," Michael said, after a long pause, "I'm really sorry, but my job is too demanding. I can't just drop everything. You and Mom will figure it out. You always do." "Figure it out?" My chest tightened. He said it like Sarah's illness was a business problem, not a death sentence. When I told Lily, she sighed. "Dad, you know I love Mom, but I'm just starting a huge campaign at work. My boss has me under a microscope. I can't afford to take time off right now. Maybe after the next quarter." Her words were like a dagger. Cancer didn't wait for quarters. Josh was my last hope. My easygoing, carefree youngest. He listened silently before finally saying, "Dad, I don't mean to sound harsh, but isn't this kind of your responsibility? You and Mom always handled stuff. Why should it fall on us now?" I froze. "Your responsibility?" Those words rang in my ears. "She's your wife," he added. "Not our problem. Not our problem." I hung up the phone and sat in silence. The house felt unbearably quiet. Sarah was upstairs, resting after another rough night, unaware of the conversation I'd just had. Tears blurred my vision as I realized the unthinkable. The children we had sacrificed everything for, the children we had loved without condition, were turning their backs on us in our darkest hour. But I couldn't tell Sarah. I couldn't burden her with the heartbreak of knowing her children had abandoned her. So I carried that pain alone. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Every day was a battlefield. Driving Sarah to chemo. Sitting beside her as the toxins drained her energy, her beautiful hair falling out in clumps. Holding her hand when she vomited until her body trembled. Watching the woman I loved shrink into someone frail, yet still fighting with every ounce of strength she had left. I tried to keep it together. I smiled when she looked at me, cracked jokes to lift her spirits, and told her everything would be okay. But inside I was crumbling. One night, after putting her to bed, I sat in the living room with a photo album on my lap. Pictures of birthdays, Christmas mornings, vacations by the beach. Sarah holding Michael as a baby. Lily dressed as a ballerina. Josh riding his first bike. I remembered the late nights Sarah and I had spent working extra shifts, skipping luxuries so our kids could have more. Every photo screamed of sacrifice and love. And now, all of that seemed meaningless. The anger began to grow inside me. Not just anger at their neglect, but at the sheer cruelty of their words. Your problem. Not our problem. As Sarah's health declined, so did my patience. The children called occasionally, but only to offer shallow sympathy. None of them visited. None of them held her hand in the hospital. It was just me and her, like it had always been, though I hadn't realized it until then. One night, Sarah whispered to me, Richard, promise me something. Anything, I said, brushing her thinning hair from her forehead. Don't hate them, she murmured. They're young. They don't understand what love really means yet. Maybe one day, they'll regret it. I swallowed hard, unable to respond. Because in that moment, hate was all I felt. I wanted to scream, to call each of them, and demand how they could sleep at night while their mother was suffering. But I didn't. Instead, I held on to Sarah's hand and let her drift to sleep. Still, her words lingered in my mind. Don't hate them. But I couldn't let go of the betrayal. Weeks later, after yet another round of chemo, Sarah collapsed in our living room. I called the ambulance, my hands trembling as paramedics rushed her to the hospital. I sat outside the emergency room, praying, bargaining with God, tears staining my shirt. Hours later, the doctor came out, shaking his head. I'll never forget that moment. She's stable, but Richard, her body is very weak. You need to prepare yourself. She may not have much time left. The floor fell out from under me. I walked into her room, seeing her fragile body hooked up to machines, her breathing shallow. I held her hand, whispering words of love and gratitude, while my heart shattered inside me. And where were my children? Not here. Not at her bedside. Not comforting the woman who had given them life. That was when something inside me snapped. I knew then that this wasn't just a tragedy. This was betrayal. And betrayal deserved a reckoning. I didn't know how yet. I didn't know when. But as I kissed Sarah's forehead and promised her I'd stay strong, a dark resolve formed in my heart. If my children believed her illness was my problem, then they had no idea what problem was coming for them. Because I was going to make sure they regretted every word, every choice, every moment of neglect. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of my revenge. After Sarah's collapse, the world narrowed to the hospital, the machines, and a handful of faces who actually mattered. Her condition was fragile, every hour a negotiation between hope and reality. I stayed at her bedside when possible, but I also began to move with a different purpose. Grief makes you slow, betrayal makes you sharp. I remembered every call, every excuse, every time Michael, Lily, and Josh had pushed me away with polite distance or casual dismissal. You and Mom will figure it out, Michael had told me as if he were outsourcing compassion. Maybe after the next quarter, Lily had sighed. And Josh, my boy who used to build forts in the living room, had said something I couldn't forgive. Isn't this kind of your responsibility? Those words were the cut that would not heal. They revealed not ignorance, but entitlement. They believed they could choose when to care. They believed love had a coupon code and an expiration date. So I made a decision that was equal parts cold and clear. I would not let them slip away with their reputations unmarked. I would not simply watch as they returned to their comfortable lives with their souls unexamined. If I could not make them love, I could at least make them accountable. First, I fortified the house finances. Sarah and I had always handled our affairs quietly, trusting our estate attorney to keep things in order. But there was a clause buried in our trust that we had never needed to test, a revocable section that allowed us to amend beneficiaries if reasonable cause existed. I contacted our attorney with a simple request: draw up options. I did not say why. I told him I needed time to manage affairs if Sarah's condition took a turn. That was the truth, and that was all he needed. Next, I collected what I could from home. Receipts, shared calendars, emails I had archived, messages I'd overlooked. I printed them. Paper feels less transient than a screen. It is evidence with weight. I wanted my children to understand the timeline of their neglect, not as a personal betrayal only I felt, but as a pattern they had chosen to perpetuate. But I also needed more than paper. I needed witnesses and experts. I hired a private investigator through a colleague of my own, a man named Alan who had done discreet work for my father years ago. Alan was methodical, quiet, and practiced at the kind of impartiality I had no room for. Within a week he had produced a file, not just proof of the texts and missed visits, but of the attitude that had accompanied them. He documented voicemail messages, recorded phone calls where my children had been deliberately evasive, and had even captured a pattern of expenses and investments that showed priorities: luxury holidays, fine dining, donations to causes that were photogenic rather than human. He asked me how far I wanted to go. "As far as it takes," I said. When Sarah was awake, she would squeeze my hand and say, "Don't do anything stupid." Stupid was what love called things that felt vengeful. I loved her enough to ignore that voice. I had to be careful, legal, and surgical. Revenge that broke the law would only cheapen the moral claim. I would not become what I despised. Everything I did would be above board, visible, and incontrovertible. The legal strategy arrived in the form of an extraordinary, old-fashioned idea: accountability in public. My attorney, a woman named Claire with steel in her voice and kindness in her eyes, suggested we consider a public hearing, a civil suit for neglect, for failure to offer reasonable care and support to dependent parents when explicitly requested. The law can be odd in this country, generous in some pockets. Adult children owe few legal duties to aging parents, she warned. Emotion is not always law. But there were angles we could use: breaches of explicit verbal commitments, documented promises, and preservation of fiscal responsibility. More importantly, we could use truth as a weapon. "People respond to shame," Claire said. "They change their behavior when their public identities are at risk. If you want them to regret this, you need an audience." My audience would be the courtroom, the press, and the community that had watched my family grow. I wanted the children to feel, publicly, the weight of their choice. I filed a guardianship petition as well, purely procedural at that stage, to ensure that someone authorized could make decisions should Sarah's capacity decline further. It put a legal spotlight on our situation. It also required her children to engage formally, to attend hearings, to provide statements. That engagement is different. It is not casual, it is recorded. It deters flippancy. When the notices arrived, Michael called with a clipped voice. "What is this?" he demanded. "Dad, you can't." "Watch me," I said. The line went silent for a long time. Lily texted first, an apology sandwiched between supposed obligations. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'll be there this weekend." Josh sent a cold emoji and an offer to FaceTime. "When I get a minute." They did not understand the gravity. They thought a hearing was a hoop to jump through. They were still playing life by convenience. That would change. In those weeks before the hearing, I became a machine of calm. I learned to separate the surge of emotion in my chest from my actions. I practiced walking into rooms with people I loved and smiling without giving them the gift of immediate forgiveness. People assume anger leads to spectacle. In reality, the most effective anger is the quiet kind, accumulative, inevitable. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, the courthouse smelled of coffee and paper. I wore a navy suit Sarah had bought me years ago for our anniversary, simple, respectful. She liked me in blue. I kissed her forehead before leaving, and she squeezed my hand so tight the nurse smiled. The courtroom was small, a bench for the judge, a few rows for family and the public, a press table. When my children arrived, they wore the look of people dressed not for court but for another kind of performance. Michael in a tailored blazer that cost more than my mortgage once did, Lily with carefully arranged hair, and Josh with his casual chic that said he had important meetings all day. They expected to make statements, sign some forms, and be done. They did not expect to be held to account. Claire presented the facts with a crisp clarity that made my chest ache, because she did it in a voice that made the world listen. She read texts aloud, my children's words, the excuses, the promises to pop by someday. She produced emails in which Lily wrote she was just swamped, while Michael's calendar showed a board dinner at a restaurant 2 hours from the hospital, scheduled during a day Sarah had chemo. The private investigator's log was read into evidence, missed calls timed purposefully, messages opened and ignored, a voicemail from Josh that had said, "We don't need to do this, they'll be fine." The judge's face shifted from professional neutrality to something colder. The public presence in the room, Old neighbors, a nurse who had watched Sarah's decline, a pastor, shifted, leaning forward. My children looked sick. For the first time, they were not the masters of their own narratives. Their words were in the judge's official record. They could not later say they had never been asked. They could not say they had been unaware. Michael sputtered. "Dad, you don't understand my job." "You had time for meetings," Claire said softly. "You scheduled them during treatments." Lily's voice cracked when she said, "I thought Mom needed space." "Space?" the judge asked. "You thought space meant absence?" Josh repeated the line that had started everything. "Isn't this kind of your responsibility?" He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. I did not shout. I addressed the court instead. "Your Honor," I said, "I love my children. I raised them. But love is not an automatic passport from accountability. When a woman who raised 3 children lies in a hospital bed and cries out for her son or daughter, and they respond with a calendar or a corporate excuse, that has consequences. I did not come here to punish them for being busy. I came here because I was ignored. I came here because the adults there have a moral obligation." The judge listened. He asked questions about intent, about what I wanted. What I wanted was simple: acknowledgement, an order for the children to participate meaningfully in Sarah's care, and an opportunity for them to make amends in a way that had teeth. The judge, balancing compassion and statute, ordered mediation and a temporary plan, scheduled visits, documented involvement, and a requirement that they meet with Sarah's care team. He warned them sternly that the court would revisit custody of financial decision-making should the children continue to be absent. It was a small win, procedural, but meaningful. A court does not fix hearts. It does force people to look in a mirror. That night, in the dim hospital room, Sarah turned her head and took my hand. "Did they come?" she asked. "A little," I said, and because I loved her, I added, "They will have to do more." She smiled faintly and let out a soft laugh that was half joy and half relief. "Good," she whispered. "Don't let them off easy." The mediation process, however, revealed a deeper ugliness than I had expected. In private, my children did more than argue about time. They argued about inheritance. Michael said in a voice dripping with entitlement, "You have to understand, Dad, our lives are structured. If we're forced into this, it changes our plans. The trust is a key part of why we work so hard." Lily bluntly asked whether Sarah's illness would affect our shares. Josh said, more directly than a son should, "If we dip into a trust or lose earnings because we stop working, that's on you and Mom." It was as if their compassion had been auctioned off and the bids were being compared. I recorded much of this. There are many ways to capture truth now. Recordings, with consent in some states and with careful legality in others, became part of the documentation. I did not tell them at the time. You don't warn a person you are building a case against. They would change behavior only if they did not know the audience. As negotiations stalled, Claire filed an action to modify the will temporarily, an unusual move, and one that made even the judge blink. We invoked what we could: failure to perform, reasonable familial obligations, and evidence of abandonment. It was an audacious legal maneuver, but audacity is sometimes appropriate when the moral order itself is shaken. Meanwhile, Sarah's condition wavered. Some days she was lucid and sharp, cracking jokes about how she'd always been the stronger parent. Other days she drifted, a ghost of the woman I'd married. Those lucid moments were precious. She began to talk openly in a way she hadn't before. "Promise me," she said one afternoon when the sun slanted warm through the blinds. "If anything happens to me, don't give them what they're expecting. Make them earn it. I can't fight without you," I whispered. She squeezed my hand until the four tugged. "You're not fighting alone," she said. "You have to keep your dignity." Dignity is a strange, fragile thing. You don't realize how much you depend on people to preserve it until they tear it down. I was building a case not just for Sarah's medical needs but for the dignity she deserved. And then, something unexpected shifted. The community noticed. A nurse I'd spoken to months back, who had watched Sarah every Tuesday morning, started a small campaign within the hospital, staff notes about who visited, an informal record. A former neighbor wrote a piece for the local paper about the Carter family's history of charity and sacrifice, and about a family being tested by illness. Small ripples became a tide. People began to ask questions. Why hadn't our children been present? Friends texted our kids with awkward sympathy. A few of Michael's board contacts asked if everything was okay. Vanity is quick to react to gossip. What I wanted was not gossip. I wanted responsibility. But I used what was available. We approached settlement talks publicly. Claire pressed for a mandatory schedule of visits, hospital participation, and a formal apology recorded in court. My children balked. I sensed that the fabric of their self-regard was unstitched. Michael's face would flush when the cameras peered down the courthouse steps. Lily's manager called, and she excused a meeting to come. Josh began to make promises to help more. The court made a tentative order. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it forced engagement. During one ordered visit, Michael arrived, unshaven and defensive. He sat stiffly by Sarah's bed like a man who had forgotten how to be small and human. He said awkward things, about work, about stress, and he pressed his lips together when she tried to speak. Later, in the hallway, he apologized. It sounded rehearsed. I kept the recording. Weeks passed and a pattern emerged. They complied, superficially. They filled their hours with checkboxes, visits, forms signed, calls returned. They posted curated photos of family time on social media. It was performative, but it was something. For Sarah, something was better than nothing. And then the reckoning I'd been stealing for approached. The formal hearing to determine whether the court would allow me to temporarily change the distribution of assets to ensure Sarah's care. The day the hearing was scheduled, the courthouse was packed. Reporters filed in, neighbors took seats. The public had a hunger for truth, and family drama now sold headlines. Claire walked into conference with a stack of evidence that glowed like a legal torch. We were not there to burn people down. We were there to show the damage done by inaction. We submitted the messages, the recordings, the dates missed, the witnesses who spoke about the family's neglect, and testimonies from medical staff about the emotional impact of absence on a patient. The hearing was meticulous. My children were there in person this time, their attorneys at their side. They sat together, a unit by birth, and yet a divide had formed on the inside. Michael attempted to argue that his absence was due to unavoidable professional obligations. Lily insisted that she had offered help and had been misunderstood. Josh, ashamed and defensive, said, "We're trying to balance lives. This isn't about not loving Mom." Claire presented what cannot be dismissed. Actions and words documented and framed into a narrative. A family that had prioritized career and comfort over presence in a parent's final months. The judge listened, occasionally marking notes. Finally, he looked at my children. "Do you acknowledge responsibility?" he asked. Michael swallowed. I regret my choices," he said slowly. Regret is a weak currency in a courtroom. The judge asked for more, a plan, commitments, and a demonstration of remedial action. Claire's closing moved from indictment to compassion. "This is not about punishing the children," she said. "It is about ensuring Mrs. Carter receives the dignity of care. It is about a family honoring what it has created." Then the judge did something I had hoped he might do. He asked for the children to deliver statements, in court, addressed to their mother and to the public. He wanted sincerity. He ordered that their statements be recorded publicly and included in the court's final considerations. That's when the collapse happened. Michael stood up first. He spoke haltingly. "Mom, Sarah, there are so many times I wasted being somewhere else. I thought I was doing what I needed to do. I see now how small I made myself." His voice cracked. He looked at Sarah and then at me. For the first time, a father can be proud of a son not for his ledger, but for his remorse. He faltered, and then silently sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of his own words. Lily followed, hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she said. "I thought I was making sacrifices in my career." I didn't realize what I was sacrificing for." Her voice broke like thin glass. She looked older all of a sudden, the illusion of invincibility gone. "Then Josh." He stood, a loose apology caught in his throat. He said, "Dad, Mom, if I could take back the times I didn't answer the phone, I would. I was a coward." He collapsed, not physically, but into an emotion I hadn't seen him allow before: shame. His knees buckled with the realization. They did not physically fall to the ground, but they crumpled inward. That inward collapse was worse. It was the acknowledgement, public and irrevocable, that they had been absent at the gravest hour. The cameras caught faces with no filters. The community that had admired them now watched them in a way that would follow them for years. I felt a complicated surge: relief, sorrow, vindication. This was not glee. Revenge had a bitter core. Seeing them humbled did not erase the months of lonely nights, or the tremors in Sarah's hand when I was not there fast enough. But it changed the currency. It made consequence follow choice. The judge did not sentence them. This was not a criminal trial. But he did instruct that until Sarah's needs were fully assessed and a sustainable plan for care put in place, certain access to estate distributions could be modified. It was not theft. It was preservation. If they wanted their inheritance to remain intact, they would have to demonstrate consistent, documented care and to make amends in meaningful, legally recorded ways. When the hearing adjourned, the press swarmed. I watched my children step out, faces pale, how the world's eyes had shifted. It was not just about money now. It was about trust, about the social contract they had violated. That night, Sarah was tired. But she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did this for me." "No," I said honestly. "I did this for both of us. So they remember who built them." Her smile was ragged but genuine. "That is enough," she said. In the months that followed, things changed. My children complied with the court's orders. They visited more consistently, not out of performance but because the court required documentation that they had provided care. They sat in meetings with social workers, learned medical care tasks, sat through chemotherapy sessions. It was awkward. It was clumsy. It was human. I don't think their transformation was instantaneous or complete. You can't remake someone overnight. But what I saw was the beginning of remorse translating into action. They apologized in person, on camera, on forms that would become exhibits. They paid for services and set time aside. They visited hospital floors they had previously ignored. They began conversations I had longed to have with them, about values, legacy, and what truly matters when life becomes a ledger. As for me, the revenge I had imagined was not a moment of triumphant cruelty. It was the slow, legal, undeniable fact that neglect has consequences. It was the illumination of truth in a place where excuses cannot hide. They were forced to look at themselves and make amends or lose what they had assumed was theirs without effort. Sarah's health held unpredictable patterns. Some weeks were better, some worse. I learned to seize the small joys. The brief clarity when she joked about the hospital food, the afternoon when she dozed in the sun and hummed a song with me, the night she said she could taste orange again after months. The revenge had not cured her. It had given her dignity. One crisp morning, as autumn painted the trees in burnt gold, Sarah took my hand and said, "Promise me something else." "What?" "That when I'm gone, you won't let bitterness be your legacy. Make them better, not broken." I looked at her and understood the ultimatum of grace. Revenge had been satisfying in a way that protected what she needed. But grace was a longer game. I agreed. When Sarah passed a few weeks later, she was surrounded by recorded evidence of truth and the small, stumbling gestures of children who had learned painfully what it meant to be present. The funeral was complex, full of sorrow, apology, and memory. Michael gave a eulogy that read as contrite and full of love. Lily spoke of the woman she'd once taken for granted. Josh, with eyes rimmed red, admitted his cowardice. They did not receive absolution easily. No one does. But they committed to being better men. Years later, the changes remained mixed. Michael remained a banker, but he taught seminars about corporate responsibility and family balance. Lily pivoted her marketing career toward healthcare advocacy, spurred by guilt that turned into purpose. Josh started volunteering at a hospice center, a small, awkward penance that healed him slowly. As for me, I kept the house largely the same. I kept a chair by the window where Sarah used to sit, and sometimes, when the light was right, I would feel as if she was still humming softly in the next room. I took slow walks through the garden and tended the roses she loved. I visited hospitals as a volunteer, not to punish the absent, but to offer presence where people needed it. Presence is its own kind of revenge, one that builds instead of destroys. If you asked me whether I would do it again, go public, drag my children into the light, force them to confront themselves, I would say yes, but not with triumph. I would say yes out of necessity. There are moments in life when silence is itself a consent to cruelty. I refused that consent. I chose consequence over private pain. When the world asked later about what had happened, I told the truth plainly. Sometimes the people we raise will disappoint us. But disappointment does not mean we cease to act. We must choose whether to let neglect become a habit that spreads like mold in the corners of the heart, or to expose it to light and clean house. My revenge was not black-eyed triumph. It was the sober work of ensuring dignity for the woman I loved and making sure that my children could never again pretend their absence was not their problem. I did that, and in the quiet after, I found a strange kind of peace.